You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Schatten. My guests today are Edgar Schein and his son, Peter Schein. Edgar is a Professor Emeritus at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He is considered one of the foremost experts on organizational culture. His articles and books are read and cited by just about anyone addressing issues of culture and organizational change. Edgar has a master's in social psychology from Stanford and a PhD in social psychology from Harvard. Maybe it's in the Schein DNA, but Peter Schein is also an expert in organizational culture. He's the co-founder and COO of the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute. Peter has worked in a variety of management roles in a diverse set of companies in Silicon Valley. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Edgar and Peter Schein. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So you have a book that's come out called Humble Leadership, and it takes a lot of the assumptions of the great leader model that has made its way through the leadership literature over the past half a century. That we have a leader that's up on high, and they're in a command and control situation, and you take odds with a lot of that, and you lay out different tiers of relationships that leaders can have with subordinates, that colleagues can have with each other. So I thought we'd just start off by giving a high level perspective of your new conception of leadership called humble leadership.
I think the word humble is the key to that we have seen throughout history and more in today's world, that what people face in the way of problems to be solved, whether they are the CEO or in the middle of the organization or in a group trying to get a job done, it's no longer possible for an individual to have all the information from which to make the decision. So the main point about humble leadership is the recognition that when you're facing a problem, you are dependent on other people, either the people who report to you or your peers or even the people above you, to give you honest and accurate information so that you can co-create the next decision, the next move, and that is going to be the nature of the leadership of the future. It's not the lone hero making decisions, but people all throughout an organization facing problems, recognizing their dependence on others, and building relationships that provide the information necessary to make the decisions and do the adaptive move.
Right, because one of the issues with the lone hero leadership model is that the information that might not have needed the depth of information 50 years ago, but that today, with the amount of complexity that businesses face and organizations face, that there's just no way that a single individual can gather up the information that they need on their own.
That's fundamentally correct. We like to say that it's possible for a very smart, capable leader to ask all of the right questions. But we're suggesting that given the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, using that VUCA term, the leader really needs to be confident that he's going to get answers to the questions that he doesn't ask, because there's more going on than that one brilliant leader can necessarily capture and assimilate and use to form a strategy or a set of decisions.
So why wouldn't they get the information that they seek ordinarily?
Well, I think the problem is that we've built a managerial leadership model that has worked very well in the bureaucratic machine age of industrial organization. But in that model, what we see over and over again is that direct reports or peers find themselves so locked into their roles and so insecure in the hierarchical promotional system that even if the leader knows the questions to ask, there is lots of evidence that the direct report or team member will not feel safe in giving information if that information is negative or problematic.
So what's the risk? What's the risk of revealing negative information for a lot of people? Like, why do they feel that that's a big risk?
Because in our culture, we punish whistleblowers. Bosses send all kinds of signals to their direct reports that they want things to work well. They want the subordinate to fix the problem and not come running to the boss with saying, the machine is obsolete. We need a new machine. All the scandals, all the major accidents, we're going to find in the recent Boeing case. There were situations where engineers or others had opinions that maybe this plane possibly wasn't ready to fly, or maybe the training of foreign pilots wasn't good enough, but either that information didn't get to the right place or was deliberately ignored. So the big argument for why we need this new model is that the old model just plain doesn't work anymore. We see too many examples of bad quality, safety, and other issues resulting from a failure of upward and downward communication.
Right. So one of the classic ways that this has been shifted has been the impact of the Toyota production model. There's a really interesting This American Life and tons of books that are written about the difference between Toyota production and GM production. And one of the things that Toyota does is they incentivize their even baseline employees to pull the line and stop the production at any possible issue. And they're incentivized to find problems with the way that they're producing cars. And that was in contrast in the 80s, especially with GM, where the rule was that the car production system just could never stop under any circumstance. And people were encouraged never to bring up safety issues or quality issues. Is that one of the things that you guys are getting at?
Exactly. GM is an interesting case. They used the Toyota production system totally in the NUMMI plant out here in Fremont, California, and had very good results. But clearly, that system was somehow culturally so different from all of GM's regular ways of working that rather than introducing that system in their other plants, they simply let that go. And they let Saturn, which was a different way of doing things, which was more based on trust and openness, they let that go. We seem to, in some of the old industries, like the bureaucratic system because it maintains distance between people. And we're arguing that unless you shorten that distance, make people feel psychologically safe, you're not going to get the right information and therefore wrong decisions.
So the Toyota and GM example, we see that in a lot of places, right? You'll have a particular division that operates under trust, openness, high psychological safety, and then it's never able to scale to a larger organization. Why does that happen? What are things that people can do so that these ideas spread larger than just a small team or a smaller division?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we talk about in this book that really is sort of the highest mountain to climb is that this culture of openness and trust has to start at the board, if not the CEO, right? So the senior levels of the organization have to believe that cultivating these, what we refer to as level 2 relationships that are based on openness and trust, start, at the very top of the organization and filter down through, every division. But I think we also have the systemic issue that divisions are often competing with each other. And it's that internal competition that starts to lead to concealment of information. And, the issues snowball from there.
Well, let's unpack that competition a little bit. So, are you referring to that? Sometimes you'll have 3 different divisions within a company, and each is competing for resources and talent, and so they act more oppositionally to each other.
I mean, I think that the fact that they're competing for resources and talent, if you can show me an organization that really doesn't do that fundamentally, I'd love to see it. It's scarce resources are essentially what our economy is built around, so that's inevitable that competing for resources happens. I think the issue is, can the leaders in those quote unquote competing divisions rationalize based on a collective vision of where the company is really going? And oftentimes, and Ed tells a lot of stories about what happened at Digital Equipment Corporation in his book "Deck is Dead," that you ultimately had division heads with a different vision of the future, and so they couldn't ever come to that sort of that collective vision. And that meant that resources, these scarce resources, ended up being, underutilized or squandered. So,
what do you recommend for competing divisional leaders to better empathize with one another?
Well, there are a couple of examples in the book. Probably the best one is Virginia Mason Hospital in Seattle. Because that also connects to the Toyota production system. What the CEO did, the new CEO, they were in financial trouble. They had to do sort of a major redo of the whole hospital system. The first thing he did was to take his top medical chiefs and administrators to Japan for a 2-week visit of Japanese companies that were using the Toyota system, to expose them personally to what a different system might look like. And then when he came back, he said, do any of you see any connection between what you saw and how we run the different parts of our hospital? And only if they saw a project that looked interesting did they then collectively decide, well, let's try to do that. And they all learned the system of how to do it. The concept here is the concept of creating more teams. And the U.S. is, particularly using the team concept as a means to an end rather than as a primary decision-making mechanism. So we have General McChrystal saying, titling his book Team of Teams, saying that, even in a hierarchy, we can't make all the decisions. It's the boots on the ground that know what's actually going on. And so we have to delegate to them. Then one other example that gets more directly at your question is how some European companies operate. When I was working in the 70s and 80s with big chemical conglomerates, Ciba-Geigy, they had a 11-person board run by a managing director who was de facto the CEO. But the interesting thing was, over the years, that board had decided that each board member must, every 3 years, rotate through a function and a division, so that by the time they were a mature group, there was no competition between them because they each knew all the parts of the business. And that's what we don't do. We don't rotate Division A general manager through B and C and D. We make them each be champions of their own division and see who can make the best story, be most convincing. And that's exactly the wrong way to do it. They should each at that level, at board and CEO level, each be totally familiar with every function and every division so that they could then function as a group to make a decision. That's what's missing.
One of the things that I've seen, I don't know if you mentioned this in your book or not, an activity that you'll see that somewhat gets at this is to have division leaders make presentations on behalf of the other division at major meetings, and to literally spend days prepping the case for the other division. And they take it, and the companies that do it, they'll take it seriously because they know that that division B is going to be representing them. And so it gets them to at least put themselves in the shoes of their other divisions.
I think that's a marvelous idea. I have not been aware that any company anywhere does that.
Yeah, one of the things that we see out here in Silicon Valley is that we're talking about this benefits of this kind of rotation mentality, but at the same time, the importance of specialization is so acute out at the tip of the spear of technology that you do have this tension. Can you take somebody who knows, way more about, the largest scale integration, microelectronics, and have them be in charge of the cloud strategy? Does it?
Oh no. So they're not in charge of the other division. It's just part of when they have a board retreat, when they have a major retreat. Part of the process is that they make a pitch for the other side.
Right. I think
definitely not at the granular detail that the other division is going to have. There's no way.
Right. But I think that the question is that a great exercise to go through, and it creates some sort of empathy across the senior levels of the organization. But when the exercise is over, it's over. That's the concern. And what Ed was describing in the Siva Gayu example is that was that was the way they progressed. That was the way senior leadership happened. They knew that they would be leading other divisions. And while that might still be a great model, we do see that I think it's a byproduct of this VUCA, world that we live in, that specialization is so highly valued that there's always that tension against the great generalist and the super specialist. It's just, I think we're going to have that tension,
right?
Indefinitely.
I was wondering, can you go through just a broad overview of the different levels from what you call -1 all the way through 3?
Yeah, sure. These are levels that I believe exist in the broader societal culture. These are not levels that we've invented. That one way of relating to another person is to dominate them. Parents do that with their children. Prison guards do that with their prisoners. There are all kinds of slave bosses do that with their workers. We call that -1 because even though it exists, it's undesirable in civil society. We consider that inappropriate. Level 1 is what we do consider the appropriate civil level in society, which is that we all get along in terms of our normal roles as fellow citizens, as customers, as purveyors of services. All the normal daily transactions are done in terms of what we've learned is the proper role. The doctor learns how to be a doctor. Patients learn how to be patients. People who buy and sell know how to do that. But it's all premised on not getting too close to the other person. Stay in your role. When you're buying something from a salesperson, you don't want to get involved with where they live and some other aspects of you want to stay in the sales role. So that's what most of our life is like. But we also know that when we have a friendship, we get closer, we reduce the psychological distance with the other person. We want to know them more as an individual because that feels good and is something we naturally want to do. We want to get closer. And then the third level, level 3, is real intimacy, which we have with close friends, confidants, lovers, spouses. And the argument now is, can organizations function effectively at level 1, or do superiors and subordinates and teammates not get to level 3 necessarily, but to develop a level 2 relationship, which is, I not only know you and your role, but I want to get to know you better so that we can build up more trust and communication. It's this level 2 that we think is the key to future relationships in organizations. It's tricky because it'll make a lot of people nervous to get closer to each other, but not too close. On the other hand, if they don't, the job won't get done. The information won't circulate. People won't develop enough trust.
So how do you see this playing out in a traditional hierarchical system? And I guess as a follow-up to that, have you received a lot of pushback as you've presented this in your consulting and in your teaching?
The way I would sell this is to give lots of examples. I remember years ago when I was teaching Sloan Fellows, the question would come up, do your subordinates tell you the truth, and do you have a good relationship with them? And there was always about maybe 5%, very small number, of these executives in the class who said, that's a funny question. I don't have any problem at all with my subordinates. I'm very comfortable. They tell me everything. And others in the class looking at them funny, like, what's your magic? What did you do? And when you interview those people, most recent case, a grandson, Oliver, who graduated with an engineering degree and had to take over a production line, a bunch of unionized people. He said, well, I got to know them right away. We ended up having a comfortable relationship. He took that as part of the job. So it's getting to know people is something we all know how to do. And for some reason, our organizations imply that we shouldn't do it.
I think the other thing that the other distinction we like to make is that level 1 is transactional, where and we all, I think we've, since Frederick Taylor, we've sort of been believing that maintaining those transactional, professionally distant relationships is how we can scale the organization up, and we can scale the organization down if we need to. One of the questions that I've been asked is, well, sure, I understand the benefit of these kinds of level 2 relationships, but what if you have to fire somebody? And my response to that is, if you have a true, open, trusting relationship, and you have to fire somebody, let's break down why you have to fire somebody. If you have to fire somebody because you're doing a reduction in force, you have to shrink the business. I would rather have a whole person to whole person relationship with either somebody who works for me or somebody I work for when that decision has to be passed down. I think most people would. And again, I'm open to challenge and debate on this, but I believe that in that situation, when it's the factors of the business and the market that are driving a reduction in force, it's better to have people with an open and trusting relationship when those decisions have to be executed. If, on the other hand, it's a performance issue, um, it may well be that you weren't sharing information openly. You weren't, that either the boss or the subordinate were concealing information. In which case, I would argue you don't actually have a level 2 relationship. You've still, maintained a transactional relationship. So I think that often the question that is most vexing to people about this idea is that it just seems like how could you possibly scale this? How could you possibly scale personal relationships across the organization? And it seems again like that sort of big mountain to climb, but not if it's taken at a team by team basis, right? We're not suggesting that every middle manager has to have a whole person to whole person relationship with every other middle manager. But in the immediate, what we like to call a job role map, the people that you are connected to in your work, the transition from level 1 to level 2 provides more frictionless information flow within that extended group, and that's what we're saying is going to be needed more and more in the future.
I wonder how much of the relationship differences comes down to personality, in that, right? So you have some managers or some members of teams who are more extroverted, and it's just going to be natural for them to have the free exchange of ideas. Some are going to be more introverted. You're going to have people that are higher on authoritarian scales, lower on authoritarian scales, and so there's a natural tendency to be more in the level 1 versus level 2. So that's kind of what I'm thinking through, is just that you're going to have an enormous amount of differences between people, and then at the same time, what I think would be immensely beneficial, even for those who do not buy into the level 2 or the humble leadership framework, would be that most people are not aware at all whether they're in more of a level 2 relationship framework or a level 1. And the mere training and awareness of how they're interacting and the impact that has on information and performance, that would be a valuable conversation, even if somebody, for personality purposes or for just they're 60 years old and have operated in the same manner for 40 years, do not move necessarily into a level 2 ideology or behavior pattern. But the awareness of how those relationships impact information, I think, could be really valuable. What do you think about that take? And feel free to completely disagree.
No, I completely agree, and I'll step in before Ed. But to your earlier point about sort of where you are on the introvert extrovert scale, I think just being aware and being sort of personally aware of the people that you work with, sort of where they are on that scale is immensely important. If you ask yourself, I kind of need to know what's the right way to connect with this person who comes across as very gregarious or very shy, forcing yourself to ask that question, not, what is my obligation in my role and what is their obligation in their role. It's sort of leaving the roles aside and spending a day just trying to relate to the people as people. But the other thing that I would say is that there are some industries, markets, businesses where this maybe isn't necessarily desirable or appropriate. And maybe what it comes down to is if you're in a highly transactional field where it really is just about executing transactions efficiently, then maybe this isn't critical. But in places where you have to, create the future, where you have to innovate, where you have to find new markets and develop new products for new customers, information sharing, in an unencumbered way is absolutely critical. And so, but I really do like your point that, as in so many things, if we take the time to reflect and discuss, that's so much of the progress and solution right there. Just to kind of start asking the question, what kind of relationship do I have with the 20 people that I interact with on a daily or weekly basis? Reflecting on those relationships rather than just letting every day go by, just executing the transactions that we call work.
There is let me add something important here. We're kind of treating it as a one-on-one situation, but the reality is a lot of this problem will exist in meetings and in groups and in teams. And the question of how we get a team or a group to function at level 2 is a whole other issue, besides how do I just manage my individual relationships. And there I see a really big mountain to climb, because I think we are so inimical. We hate groups, we hate meetings, we think they waste time. And yet the world is forcing us to do more and more work in teams and groups. So one of the biggest challenges is going to be how managers and leaders of the future are going to develop the skills to bring a group together and function as a team and build those relationships in the team, which is precisely what the military is discovering, that they're not going out there as individual infantrymen. They're going out in clusters and groups, and they have to develop almost level 3 relationships if they're doing complex coordinating tasks. Or in hospitals, the operating room has to be a very tightly knit, high trust, high openness kind of group, so that if mistakes are made, somebody else will immediately correct them.
Can you tell me more about the military? In your book, you cover a few examples about I don't remember the people's names that kind of take a humble leadership approach, and in an environment that is otherwise the most rigid hierarchy that we have in the world.
Well, the key is the task requires coordination. And if the task requires coordination, the boss can't do that for you. The team has to learn who each other are, what each other's skills are, and they have to practice. They have to go into all kinds of simulations. And the boss in the hierarchy can be the facilitator and maybe even the coach, but the actual work will be done in an interactive way by the members of the team. And so they have to learn who each other are and get comfortable with each other to the point where they risk their lives for each other. Or similarly in the OR, the anesthesiologist, the various techs, the chief nurse, the attending surgeon, they better know each other very well, because the patient's life is in the balance. If they don't coordinate well, or give each other the wrong instrument, or fail to correct something that's going on. So I think it's what Peter was saying, this reality of the work we do requires us to go beyond just you stay in your role and I'll stay in my role. That doesn't lend itself to coordination.
So it's interesting because I think at the same time that we have these examples with health and with the military and with a lot of larger corporations, we also have the changing trend in the development of artificial intelligence and virtual teams and the gig economy. We think of things such as Amazon Turk or Uber or whoever the delivery service that delivers your groceries to your doorstep. How do you see that impacting level 2 relationships? And are level 2 relationships possible in an artificial intelligence gig economy world?
Well, so I think simply yes, but the issue is that it's the level 1 relationships that the AIs and the Turks are going to be much more adept at fulfilling, right? That we're basically making that point that it's the parts of our economy or our industry that are really a matter of understanding an algorithm and executing transactions according to that algorithm. That's the thing that humans are overqualified for. And
Okay.
well, I mean, now that we have AIs and other ways of replacing human work appropriately. But that's why, I like the way Tom Friedman, inverted AI and refers to it as intelligent assistance, because that suggests that it really will be the humans that are making the decisions and the intelligent assistants that are providing more of the information, vastly more information in order to make these decisions. But you still have that issue of all of that information, all of those inputs may be far better assimilated by the intelligent assistant, but it's still ultimately the humans that we want making the key decisions. And those key decisions have to be in the context of that organization. And it's other humans at that level that are fed all of this great information by this intelligent assistance that have to coordinate across to make sure that these decisions are made in the whole context of the organization.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting point, right? So to distinguish between really two parts of our economy, two different types of many organizations, some and many of which are going to continue to be automated and heavily technology driven, and those will naturally sit with the type 1 relationships, with the level 1 relationships, and then the ones that survive and that are still, or survive maybe isn't the right word, but those businesses that are still, people sitting in rooms or even virtually on teams, that the stakes will be very high and that you'll need more level 2 relationships.
Right.
You also raised the question, is it possible to have a level 2 relationship virtually? And I think we're seeing that we are evolving all kinds of virtual groups that I think are high level openness and high level trust. So somehow, maybe initially they were face to face. There's a lot of evidence that you have to start with getting to know the person face to face. But once you've made that connection, it's possible to sustain a level 2 relationship over distance. I have a number of such relationships on Zoom and other devices with people all over the world. Distance is no longer an issue, and we feel we have open conversations.
We're running out of time. I'd like to just close with a thought. Ed, it's interesting, you in particular, who your work has been seminal in a lot of the areas for organizational behavior. And you, as somebody who is at probably the later part of your career, has created what seems to me to be part of the ethos of the millennials. I think if you were to really capture a leadership value system that would, I would assume, ring true to a lot of millennials, it would kind of fall into this line. So it's interesting that you've. Is this an adaptation for you? Is this something that's been longly held? I'm just kind of curious about the generation difference.
I think I learned the deep values about trust and communication long time ago in the 40s and 50s when organization development evolved. But I think it's taken a long time for societies and organizations to recognize that more and more of the problems we have or the things we can't do derive from level one kinds of cultures that just aren't adapted to the complexity of what we're trying to do. And the young people entering the world, I think, are more ready to have level two relationships.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's more personally rewarding. There's no fun just being locked in a role and have your boss tell you, I don't want your whole person here. I just want you to do your job. That's not how the young people are feeling. So we're still climbing the mountain, but I think we may be closer to the top.
The other thought I have on that is that, and maybe this is just because I started my career in the 90s in Silicon Valley. And at that time, there were still a lot of, basic physics and science problems to be solved. There wasn't a lot of memory in a computer in 1991. The idea of, storage at mass scale didn't exist. The idea of speed of light telecommunications basically didn't exist, at least at the commercial level. And but we've kind of solved all those. We have supercomputers in our pockets. We have infinite bandwidth. We have infinite storage, and with cloud computing, we have infinite compute, basically. So it's really much more challenging in some respects to come up with innovations that are going to matter and are going to sell and are going to become, viable products and ultimately big companies. And those innovations typically we're seeing tend to be more social than they are technical. And right. In that context, you can completely see how for an entrepreneur anywhere from say 25 to age, or let's say age 15 to age 35, you can't do that on your own brilliance. It's a much more complicated process to come up with those unicorns and needles in the haystack. I just maybe I'm reflecting on the history incorrectly here, but so much of the basic science roadmaps were available to us in the early 90s. Those, social technical roadmaps aren't obvious like they were back in the 90s. The issue was in the 90s, we knew what we needed to do. It just was going to take us a while to get there. Now we're there.
Right.
And so I think there's something to that. It's just much more complicated to come up with really breakthrough innovation than it was in some respects, 20 or 30 years ago.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much. I've loved talking to you too. This has been a pleasure, and thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us. Great discussion. Great questions.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.